Toronto, who uses his sound vision synesthesia as a tool for composing, arranging, and producing his transatlantic experimental orchestra, The Flowers of Hell. Greg Jarvis, over the past 10 years, group has received acclaim from Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, BBC Radio, rock legend Lou Reed, and NASA's Mission Control, amongst many others. Greg is a full-time professor on Durham College's Music Business Management program and also heads up the Canadian Synesthesia Association.
So normally I wouldn't use a mic, but I know Daphne's going to insist, so I will do it for Daphne there. So step one is people becoming aware that they have synesthesia. And step two is us figuring out how do we use it. And what we're seeing is more and more artists in the top of the charts, they're starting to talk in their interviews in major media about how they're using their synesthesia. So you've got Lady Gaga talking to the Wall Street Journal about how songs come to her like a rainbow flashing across her mind, or rainbow being the word of yesterday. Kanye West, he's been on Ellen talking about the colors that come to him, and also the understanding that his synesthesia gives him when it comes to not just music, how everything connects to music. Pharrell Williams, he's been talking to Oprah about how his colors, it tells him whether a note is in key or not in key. And he also talks about how it's not just seeing whether the color is right or wrong, but it's also it feels right or wrong. And this is one thing that often gets dropped out in the media and in the research studies, is the fact that it is far beyond what you see. It's the feeling that seeing this stuff gives you. When it is right, there's a euphoria that it produces, and when it's wrong, there's an anger that it produces. Lorde, the whole marketing campaign around her new album focused on her synesthesia. The first single from it was called Green Light. And in the interviews she did for that with the New York Times, with Teen Vogue, she was talking about how she'd taken all the song fragments and lyric fragments she had as she was composing everything for that record, and she had a table where she used colored sticky notes, and she had those all spread out on the table. And working on the flow of the colors, she developed which bits go together as a song. And then she worked on the full color flow of the album. And the whole point of it being so that when she listens to her new album, Melodrama, it sets off her colors like nothing else does. And that produces that euphoria that I was mentioning. Charlie XCX, UK artist there, she talks about the understanding of music that seeing it gives her. Frank Ocean goes on about his colors, Alessia Cara as well. And then Deb Hines, who records under the name Blood Orange, he's given a TED Talk a couple years back now, maybe 3 years ago, where he coined the term color palettes to describe how he's got his favorite chords. They're the ones that set things off for him more than anything else. So he uses those chords again and again because they're his favorite colors. For me, I don't get colors. I see all sounds as abstract shapes around me. So rather than calling it color palettes, I prefer to call it tone palettes. And what I'm going to walk you through now, I'm going to walk you through some of the sounds that I use again and again that have been on all my records of the last 15 years. And they're just bits that'll drop into a composition simply because it sprinkles on them and it sets off my mind and that synesthetic euphoria that little bit more. So I'm going to start out with playing some bar chimes for you. Now, I'm not a graphic designer, but I pulled some images off the internet. I've manipulated them to look something like what I see when I hear these sounds. So, bar chimes. Another one I'm fond of using is cymbal swells. Then timpani rolls. And I drop timpani rolls in on a lot of things simply because it's this dark cloud at the bottom and often there's nothing else occupying that space. One thing you're going to find in common, I'll come back to it later in this talk, is that all of us who see sounds, when we're working in the studio on a composition, we see all the spaces. It's not just about what we see, it's about the negative space and having the ideas and concepts of what to put into that negative space. As a guitarist, the sort of guitar playing that I most gravitate towards is that sort of twangy sliding guitar that you hear on old soul records or that you hear on recordings by the Velvet Underground. Now, many of those musicians I mentioned before, well actually all of them, they're all ones that are hugely active in the driving seat of their careers. When they're in the studio, they're very much in control of what's going on. They're also ones who are very much in control of the business end of what they do. And when they're in the studio, you've got so many options that you're able to change the textures and the shapes that you're seeing. So one thing that I love doing is adding delay effects to various notes. So that's one guitar note with a delay added. And then if I take more guitar notes and put it all together, and I love feedback. For me, it's like being surrounded by a giant blizzard. And with guitar, as much as I love that twangy sliding guitar, I also love distorted guitar, where it just makes it that bit fuller, like a big furry sort of brush stroke going on. Tremolo effects I love. They don't look quite as round as that, but it produces a sort of strobing craziness, and I'll apply that to guitar. I'll also apply it to strings. And I get the lower tones down at the bottom, they're darker. The higher tones, they're much brighter for me, and I perceive them more at the top. One thing I hate with showing the stuff like this is a non-synesthete will think, okay, it's just a 2D sort of thing, but it is a 3D, all-encompassing experience for me. One of the other effects I love to use is reverb. I'll play a sound for you without reverb. I'll play my soprano Danny Friesen singing with no reverb on her voice. And that's just kind of these round white bars for me. If I add reverb to that, then another technique I'll often use in the studio is reversing sounds. When I reverse sounds, I get sights that are quite uncommon, not like things I see in other people's music or like sounds I see every day passing through the streets. And that's dark and rising and getting lighter as it rises. And then it starts spraying off all these other notes there. And so those are all sounds that I'll drop in on any recording. But for you today, if I put all those sounds together to look at my full palette that I am fond of using, myself and many synesthetes that I know who make music, the seeing is not the big deal. It's not about seeing this shape, it's not about seeing that shape. What it's about is the understanding of how the shapes work together, and also how the music connects to everything else that we know about music and everything we know about what's beyond music. It's the understanding, to many of us, that's a far bigger advantage as musicians than simply seeing the work itself. It's the cross connections that our minds make. Kanye, in one of his interviews, he talked about how when he was making what's a modern day classic album, Yeezus, he was taking everything he knew about architecture, everything he knew about society, about texture, about classicism, about synesthesia, how everything is everything and how it's all connected, he says, And that was the starting point for his record and the real goal of what he was trying to bring all together there. A synthesis of not just his perceptual stuff, but everything that he knows and how it ties. When I hear a piece of music, I can focus in on the sight of the music, or I can also focus in on all this other metadata that's attached to it for me. Who the performer is, age of the performer, what brand of guitar does that sound like, what sort of picking technique is being used, what sort of mallets are being used on the drums, you know, any politics attached to the record, who the audience for the music is, what the channels of dissemination through the media are to reach those audiences. All of that goes on in my mind somewhat simultaneously. The same way that we synesthetes have that talent for metaphor and puns that's talked about, because of that crosstalk and that sort of metaphor thing, well, it's got nothing to do with the sensory, it's all about the crosstalk. And from that, I do believe that we experience this knowledge different to others. Of course, others are able to tap into that and think about those things, but I think we see a relationship between it all that isn't as apparent to other people. It's hard to know what is and isn't a synesthetic response. You either are a synesthete or you're not. And forgive me for saying synesthete, it's a word I've read for years before I'd ever heard anyone say it as synesthete. So, at the Canadian Synesthesia Association, well, once a month in Toronto, a bunch of us synesthetes gather together and we talk about our perceptions, and we also talk about the implications of synesthesia on everything from quantum physics through to the fields of theology. And one of our members, for media purposes, he goes by the name George. Well, George had a stroke about 8 years ago. And when he had his stroke, he lost the use of his right hand, but in the 6 months after, as his brain rewired itself, he developed pretty much every form of synesthesia in the book, except for the lower kind of grapheme ones. And with George, I'm a big fan of talking to him about how his experience of music changed. For him, music, he loved it before, just as any non-synesthete in this room is going to say they love music. He didn't know just how much one could love music, or just how much of an experience music could be. Now, he'll spend nights at home just listening to records, going for a ride, his mind hopping from note to note in a whole multi-sensory world of smells and sights and sensations around him. Some of the artists, some of the tracks that he loved before he had synesthesia, he can now no longer stand. While some of them he'd have happily danced the night away to, now he listens to them and he realizes, oh, there's no emotional read on the vocal from the record. Or, oh, there's no emotional read on the background music coming out of that record. So, what are some of the other advantages that synesthesia gives a musician? Well, as I mentioned before, there's the filling in the blanks. Right? All those artists I mentioned before, when they are in the studio, they talk about how they've got the skeleton for the song, the initial idea of it put down, and then the real joy is dropping in the stuff on top that's going to fully set off their synesthesia. One of the other things, as we've heard in the earlier presentations here at the conference, is the connection between synesthesia and having an amazing memory. If you've got a great tonal memory for everything you've ever heard as you've gone through life, and if you've got a great memory for everything you know about music, society, how it all connects, naturally that's going to be a huge advantage as a musician. The speed at which our mind is able to process all this stuff, how we make those connections instantly. Anybody who's been in the studio with Gaga talks about the speed at which she works. When I've gone into the studio with a synesthete engineer, who's the one working the knobs and faders, we do 3 days work in 1 day. Motivation. You will find all great musicians are extremely picky and want perfection. You'll find amongst synesthetes, there's that extra bit of motivation, because when we get it right, it produces that synesthetic euphoria that I was mentioning earlier on. Then there's the business side. As artists, it's not really something we talk about in interviews, but absolutely, if you can understand, all the 35 areas that an artist gets paid royalties, and what you've got to do to trigger all those royalties to flow in the most, how your audience, how the media connects with the different works that you're making, you're naturally going to be better at the business side. And as I said before, all those artists on the top of the charts I was mentioning, they're ones that are very in control of the business side of their musical careers. They're definitely not record company puppets. Then there's the creative difference. Well, if you perceive music differently, and this was something Carol Steen had written in the Oxford Handbook of Synesthesia in her chapter there, if you perceive this stuff differently, then naturally what comes out of you is going to be different to somebody who perceives music in a more common sort of way. And then there's the volume of information that our minds are able to handle. I released a symphony last year that I spent nearly 6 years developing. And with my symphony, well, normally when an artist works on a track, they're working on one song at a time, and a song will take up about 30 layers of audio, and 16 of those layers will be the drums. With my symphony though, and again, I'm self-taught, I don't do any theory. My symphony is entirely composed from me working with audio. You know, I'll lay down the basics of what I want with a custom programmed digital orchestra that I've built on my computer, and then I'll bring in some of my 24 musicians from the UK and Canada, I'll give them instructions, and I'll layer them up one by one, take by take, and then I'll move those takes around, and I'll manipulate those takes with some of those effects I was talking to you about when I was going through my tone palette. So there's 150 layers to this, and within some of these layers, there's even 20 layers of sound nestled within some of them. And so when you're able to process all this, you're able to produce these far greater, more sophisticated works of sound than somebody who's not quite able to keep up at that level of handling the information. So from this, I think the main thing that I'd like you to take away is that with synesthesia, it's much more than a sensory experience. Those of you who've researched synesthetes for a long time, those of you who've met many synesthetes, you all know, you've all had that experience where you're talking to somebody about something that's not related to senses or synesthesia at all, and then suddenly you just get the feeling, I think this person might be one. Then you explain what it is, and they're like, oh yeah, that's me, and you get that look they always give you. Well, how did you know? You weren't talking about senses, so what's going on? And I think for the researchers here today, I think that's a far great field of inquiry to be taking. There's many things being researched in terms of how my hearing might be connected to my bowels, but I think this side of things is what can open up so much more for humanity than looking at something more base like that. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll take any questions that you might have.